Your teaching makes Buddhism clear and accessible to me, maybe partly because there's something Western in your perspective. So I wonder how individual or standardized teaching is for Buddhists. I mean, in Hinduism, gurus pretty much define the religion, but in Christianity, preaching can follow pre-made outlines. Just looking for some context. How personal is your take on the Buddha's teaching? It's interesting. I mean, I don't personally think I'm very Western in my outlook. I mean, I know there are many Western teachers who have adapted the Buddha's teaching or even discarded parts of the Buddha's teaching. And not only that, even more so, have discarded the conventional ways of teaching. Because the Buddha's teaching comes with an incredibly rigid set of teaching methods. And of course not saying this is how you have to teach, but maybe rigid isn't the word, but specific. Right? How to teach the Buddha's teaching, it's all laid out, and it's mind-boggling how detailed it is. Like, there are books this thick, huge books on how the Buddha's teaching is to be expounded and how the Buddha laid out his teaching. These are commentaries explaining how it is that Buddhism is to be spread and was spread by the Buddha. And there are a lot of Western teachers who throw these out the window. Who say things like the Abhidhamma is a distortion of the Buddha's teaching, came later. People who say the commentators were not meditating, they were just study monks and had no clue about meditation and ended up with wrong ideas and so on. So for me, all of that and much, much more is what it means to have a Western outlook on the Buddha's teaching, and I don't have that. I don't think. I do have, personally, I think, I admit that, it's possible that some of the things that are passed off as the Buddha's teaching may not have been actually taught by the Buddha. But I don't go any further than that, and I don't think that's going beyond what, even for example, the Mahasi Sayadaw would say. Of course, he was quite a bit more wise and of course educated. But even he would say at times that this or that is maybe not the Buddha's teaching, or maybe it was extrapolated later, or there's something here that's a bit of a problem, and maybe there's a mistake being made, and so on. So I personally, I take quite seriously the commentaries and of course the Abhidhamma and all of the Tipitaka, and I start from the basis that it most likely is either what the Buddha taught or perfectly in line with what the Buddha taught. I start more from that vantage point, and personally feeling that I have good reason for that, because any modern commentator, any Western author or so on, or any author on Buddhism, trying to explain Buddhism, is a commentator, is creating a new commentary. You can't but be a commentator. So when a person says, don't focus on the commentaries, only focus on the Tipitaka, and the Tipitaka tells you to do this and this and this, so practice this and this and this, they're just creating a new commentary. They're taking the Buddha's teaching and explaining it in a specific way. They're interpreting it and saying, see, therefore the commentary is wrong. But that's exactly what the commentary did. So personally, it makes much more sense to me, from my point of view, to take a much more ancient and more likely to be close to what the Buddha taught, and to be taught by enlightened people, because we aren't getting more enlightened people in the world as time goes on. I wouldn't say we're getting fewer enlightened people and more diverse wrong ideas about what the Buddha taught, rather than the other way around. So much better should we accept flawed potentially flawed ancient teachings than quite likely flawed modern teachings. Anyway, this isn't what you asked, but just trying to point out that as far as the core goes, I don't even know how this is important. I'm just talking about myself, aren't I? But I think it's important to me because it's important. This outlook is important, and it's something that I feel fairly strongly about. That there's far too much freedom of the core essence of Buddha, liberty taken in regards to the core essence of Buddhism. People are very quick to discard and to change and to alter to suit modern times or a specific society or so on. They're far too quick to use this excuse, or many different excuses, to either discard some of the Buddhist teaching, or to say it wasn't the Buddhist teaching, based on their own views and opinions and interpretations of the Dhamma, saying, "Oh, it couldn't have been like that. That's wrong. No, that's not according to my meditation practice. My meditation practice shows me something different. Therefore, this teaching must be wrong." And I think that's important to answering your question, because there's a big difference between taking the same wine and putting it in new wine bottles, as opposed to taking new wine and putting it in new wine bottles. This is something a Christian saying, no? Jesus is supposed to have put new wine in new bottles or something like that, and discarded the old wine. I don't remember. So, I often find myself in that position where I'm taking ancient Buddhist teachings, like strictly from the books, and kind of disguising them or packaging them quite differently. And I think this is what makes it seem like one's teaching is adapted, or is personal, or is an interpretation or interpretative. But there is a line that's very difficult to see, but that's important not to cross, because it's hard to see the difference between an ancient teaching that is expressed, suppose it were expressed perfectly in a modern Western context, perfectly in the sense of without distorting any of the meaning, and a teaching in a modern context or packaging that is actually a deteriorating or a perversion even of that ancient teaching. And I strive to obviously not do the latter, and I think there's, as I said, much too much freedom. So I think that sort of addresses the general subject that you're talking about whether a teaching should be, or whether it is personal, or whether it's a part of the orthodoxy or an orthodox way of teaching. I'm more inclined towards teaching in an orthodox manner. I wouldn't be very interested in teaching something that was based on my own practice, for example. If I can use my own practice as an example of my teacher's practice or the Buddha's teaching, then great. And if it can reaffirm it, then great. But I would much rather, especially since it seems to have been quite beneficial for myself and for other people, to take the very orthodox Buddhist teachings and to teach in the very, very same way that my teacher taught me, but interpreting, translating it into words that other people can hear. Like, and a good example is this booklet that I wrote, and nowhere in the booklet, maybe in the footnotes, besides in the footnotes, it doesn't tell you that this is what the Buddha taught, or this comes from this sutta or that sutta. I think in the footnote I mentioned a couple of places, but actually it's all things that either I've heard my teacher tell me, in list form, or else it's something that is taken from the actual suttas themselves. I think there's an important distinction there, and I wouldn't want to have. I hope that my take on Buddhism is not personal, because to me that's dangerous. I don't feel qualified, obviously, to have the perfect take on Buddhism. So I'd much rather be merely a catalyst or a conduit for the what feel to be the pure teachings of the Buddha. I hope that helps.
You said it all.
Wow.